Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today we'll delve into events that shook the heart of the Midwest in 1904, at a time when Illinois still bore the marks of a changing land. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from anyone who's following this story with us. Illinois, in the early 20th century, was a state of stark contrasts. While Chicago gleamed as an industrial metropolis, teeming with immigrants and promising prosperity, the interior of the state maintained its rural rhythm, almost forgotten by the rapid progress of the big cities. The small farming communities scattered throughout the counties of central Illinois lived in a simplicity that seems almost unreal to us today. Dirt roads cut through endless fields of corn and wheat. Families had known each other for generations. Life followed the cycles of the seasons, and secrets, when they existed, were kept behind locked doors and discreet eyes. It was in this seemingly peaceful setting that something inexplicable began to unfold. Sangamon County, located in central Illinois, was known for its fertile farmland and hard-working communities. The state capital, Springfield, was located there, but our focus is on a more isolated area where farms stretched for miles with no nearby neighbors. In that winter of 1904, the biting cold of the American Midwest blanketed the landscape with thick snow. Nights drew in early, and darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond the small, flickering lights of kerosene lanterns. January of that year brought temperatures that plunged far below freezing. Locals were accustomed to harsh winters, but this one seemed especially cruel. Roads were impassable for days after snowfalls. The isolation was total. Farms became lonely islands in a silent white ocean. It was in this kind of environment that people depended on one another, where the absence of a neighbor at a church service or a town gathering caused immediate concern. On January 15th, a farmer named Thomas Brennan noticed something strange. He was riding along the road connecting his property to the small village of Mechanicsburg when he noticed something unusual. Smoke should have been coming from the chimney of the Hartley farmhouse, a well-known family in the area, but there was no sign of it. On a freezing morning like that, with temperatures hovering around -20 degrees, the absence of a fire was more than strange. It was potentially fatal. Thomas had known James Hartley for over 10 years. James was a hard-working man in his early 40s who ran a modest but productive estate. He lived there with his wife, Margaret, a reserved woman who was highly respected in the local community. The couple had no children, a fact that was quietly discussed in local social circles, but no one dared question it. They kept to themselves, worked hard, and attended regularly at the village Baptist church. Thomas hesitated for a moment. It wasn't customary to invade someone's privacy, but something about the scene deeply disturbed him. The house seemed dead. No movement, no sound, just the wind howling across the empty fields. He decided to approach. He dismounted and tied the reins to a nearby fence. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the front door. He knocked once, then twice. Nothing. He called James and Margaret's names. Absolute silence. It was then that he noticed something disturbing. The door wasn't completely closed, a small crack, but enough to let in the icy wind. Thomas pushed the door slowly, and it swung open with a groan of rusty hinges. The inside of the house was dark and bitterly cold. His hands were shaking, and not just from the weather. Something was deeply wrong here. He called again, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. No answer. Thomas entered cautiously. The main room was in disarray, but not the kind of mess that suggested a struggle. It was something different. Furniture slightly shifted, as if someone had left in a hurry. A chair had fallen over, plates still on the kitchen table with food scraps that had already frozen solid. The fireplace was completely dead, the cold ashes indicating no one had fed the fire in days, maybe a whole week. He toured the other rooms. In the couple's bedroom, the bed was unmade, the blankets thrown aside as if someone had gotten up in a hurry. Clothes were scattered, drawers open. Thomas felt his heart race. He searched for signs of violence, suspicious stains, anything that might explain the couple's disappearance. But he found nothing but the strange disorder and the penetrating cold that permeated every corner of the house. Outside, he examined the barn and other buildings on the property. The animals were all dead, frozen from neglect. Horses, chickens, even the cattle that should have been sheltered from the extreme cold. It was a heartbreaking scene. Thomas knew he had to notify the authorities. He mounted his horse and galloped back to Mechanicsburg, where he met the local sheriff, a man named William Porter. Sheriff Porter was known for his meticulous approach. He gathered a few men and returned to the Hartley farm that same afternoon. As the group searched the property for clues, they began to find more questions than answers. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear evidence of violent crime. But there was also no explanation for the sudden disappearance of an entire couple in the middle of a brutal winter. Investigators found something peculiar in the barn. Marks in the hardened snow suggested a wagon had been moved recently, perhaps days earlier. But where had James and Margaret gone on a freezing night, leaving everything behind? And why hadn't they warned anyone? The Mechanicsburg community was small. Everyone knew everyone else. If anyone planned a trip, it would be rumored, especially at such a dangerous time of year. Sheriff Porter began questioning the closest neighbors. Most hadn't seen the Hartleys in at least 10 days. The last person to speak to James was the owner of the general store in Mechanicsburg, who recalled a brief conversation about seeds for the upcoming season. Nothing unusual. James seemed worried about something, but the storekeeper attributed it to the typical winter hardships. Margaret hadn't been in town in even longer. Some women from church commented that she seemed more withdrawn in recent weeks, but no one thought much of it at the time. As the days passed, the story of the Hartleys' disappearance began to spread through neighboring counties. Local newspapers published short articles asking for information. The Springfield Journal devoted half a page to the mystery, describing the couple and asking anyone with information to contact authorities. But nothing came of it. It was as if James and Margaret Hartley had simply vanished into the frigid air of that terrible January. Initial investigations revealed details that made the case even more puzzling. Sheriff Porter decided to more thoroughly search the belongings left in the Hartley home. Among papers and documents stored in a drawer of James's desk, he found correspondence that shed a different light on the couple's seemingly simple life. Letters exchanged with people in other states, records of financial transactions suggesting businesses other than farming, notebook entries mentioning names unknown in the region. One letter in particular caught the sheriff's attention. It was dated November 1903, just 2 months before the disappearance. It came from someone in St. Louis, Missouri, signed only with initials that could not be immediately identified. The content was vague, but carried a tone of urgency. It spoke of an opportunity that could not be missed, and mentioned a meeting that was to take place when winter comes. The sender insisted that James keep everything confidential, including from Margaret. This discovery completely changed the direction of the investigation. Porter began to consider that the disappearance might not be the result of foul play, but a deliberate decision. Perhaps James Hartley was involved in some kind of questionable business and needed to leave in a hurry. But this didn't explain why Margaret had also disappeared, nor why they would leave behind all their belongings, including savings stored in a tin can buried in the barn, discovered during the search. The sheriff sent telegrams to authorities in St. Louis, asking for information on anyone who might be connected to the Hartleys. The response took almost 2 weeks to arrive, due to the communication difficulties of the time. When it finally arrived, it brought disturbing information. There were records of a man named James Hartley, who had been involved in business disputes in the city years before, but nothing conclusive. The case seemed to be constantly leading to dead ends. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate in and around Mechanicsburg. In a small community, the lack of answers fueled speculation. Some neighbors recalled seeing strangers in the area weeks before the disappearance. One farmer swore he heard raised voices coming from the Hartley property one December night, but dismissed them at the time. Another resident mentioned seeing an unfamiliar wagon passing along the main road at dusk, heading toward the couple's farm. The harsh winter made any extensive search difficult. Authorities organized groups of volunteers to scour the surrounding areas, especially the dense woods surrounding the rural properties. They looked for signs that the couple might have attempted to travel on foot and succumb to the cold. But snow covered everything, obscuring any traces. Frozen streams were also checked, fearing something tragic had happened there. Nothing was found. In February, when the cold finally began to break, a new lead emerged. A horse trader who traveled regularly between Springfield and Decatur reported seeing a couple matching the Hartleys' description at a Decatur inn in late January. He said they were accompanied by a younger man, someone he didn't recognize. The trio appeared in a hurry and paid cash before leaving the next morning, heading south. Sheriff Porter and 2 deputies immediately traveled to Decatur. The town, located in Macon County, was significantly larger than Mechanicsburg and served as a transit point for travelers heading to larger cities. The inn mentioned by the merchant was near the train station, a busy place where it would be easy to miss amidst so many unfamiliar faces. The innkeeper, an elderly gentleman named Edmund Price, confirmed the story. He remembered the couple because the woman seemed extremely nervous, almost frightened. She barely spoke throughout their stay. The older man, whom Edmund believed to be James, made all the arrangements and paid in advance. The third individual, the young man, stood back, waiting outside while the rooms were being arranged. Edmund described this man as someone in his early 20s, dressed in simple but suitable clothing for travel. Edmund also mentioned something the sheriff found significant. During the night, he heard voices coming from the couple's room. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone sounded like an argument. The woman was crying. In the morning, when they went downstairs to leave, she kept her eyes downcast and remained completely silent. Edmund found it strange, but he wasn't one to pry into other people's affairs. Travelers had their own problems, and he had learned not to ask questions. The sheriff asked Edmund if he knew where the trio had gone. The innkeeper replied that they had mentioned something about taking a train, but hadn't specified their destination. The Decatur train station offered routes in several directions: Chicago to the north, St. Louis to the southwest, Indianapolis to the east. Without knowing which train they had taken or whether they had actually boarded, tracking the couple was nearly impossible. Porter visited the train station and spoke with employees who worked there during the aforementioned period. The ticket agent vaguely remembered selling tickets to a small group that morning, but couldn't recall the passengers' destinations or characteristics. Hundreds of people passed through the station daily. The chances of finding specific records were slim, especially since many travelers purchased tickets under false names or simply weren't properly registered. Decatur's lead brought more frustration than enlightenment. If it really was the Hartleys seen at the inn, then they were alive and apparently fleeing from something or someone. But who was the third man? And why did Margaret seem so distressed? The sheriff began to consider darker possibilities. Perhaps the couple was being coerced, forced to leave everything behind under some kind of threat. Back in Mechanicsburg, Porter shared his findings with the community. Theories abounded. Some believed James had fallen in with criminals and was now paying the price. Others suspected a love affair that led to his escape. Some even suggested that Margaret might be ill, suffering from some mental condition that had caused her to act irrationally, dragging James down with her. None of these explanations were entirely satisfactory. The Springfield Journal published a more extensive article on the case in March, including illustrations based on the Hartleys' descriptions, and again asking anyone with information to contact them. The article caught the attention of readers in several cities in Illinois and neighboring states. Some people wrote in reporting sightings, but all turned out to be false alarms when investigated. The Hartleys' trail remained cold. As the weeks passed and spring approached, the case began to fade from the news. Other events occupied the headlines, and life continued as normal. But for those directly involved, especially Sheriff Porter and the couple's few close friends, the mystery continued to haunt. The Hartley farm remained abandoned, its fields unplanted, the empty house silently bearing witness to events no one could fully decipher. The spring of 1904 brought a thaw, and with it a discovery that would unexpectedly revive the case. In mid-April, when the creeks and streams began flowing freely again after months of freezing, a group of fishermen found something disturbing on the banks of the Sangamon River, about 10 miles from the abandoned Hartley farm. It was a suitcase, waterlogged and partially buried in the mud, revealed only because the spring floodwaters had altered the riverbank. The fishermen, residents of the small community of Athens, took the suitcase to the local sheriff's office, who immediately contacted William Porter. When the suitcase was opened, its contents astonished everyone. Women's clothing, all of good quality, some still bearing Springfield store tags. There was also a small case containing simple but valuable jewelry, including a brooch that several Mechanicsburg women immediately recognized as belonging to Margaret Hartley. It was a piece she wore on Sundays to church, a wedding gift from her late mother. The discovery raised troubling questions. Why would Margaret leave behind such personal and valuable items? If the couple were fleeing, as Decatur witnesses suggested, did it make sense to abandon belongings like that? And most importantly, how did this suitcase end up on the banks of the Sangamon River, so far from the route they presumably would have taken to reach Decatur? Porter organized a more intensive search along the river. Dozens of volunteers scoured the banks for days, searching for more evidence or, in the darkest scenario, for bodies that might have been swept away. The search stretched for miles downriver, past Athens, and on to where the Sangamon met more densely populated areas. Nothing else was found. The suitcase remained a lone enigma, a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere. The sheriff decided to re-examine the entire case from the beginning. He returned to the Hartley farmhouse, now covered in early spring vegetation, and conducted an even more thorough search. It was during this renewed investigation that one of his deputies found something that had previously gone unnoticed. In the basement of the house, hidden behind shelves of dusty canned goods, there was a hollow space in the stone wall. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, was a diary. The diary belonged to Margaret. The entries began in 1901 and continued irregularly until December 1903, just weeks before her disappearance. The handwriting was delicate but firm, and the contents revealed a woman very different from the one the community knew. Margaret wrote of profound loneliness, of the difficulty of living so isolated, of secrets that tormented her, but which she could not reveal. In a September 1903 entry, Margaret mentioned frequent arguments with James about money. He was involved in business dealings she disapproved of, though she didn't elaborate on what exactly. She mentioned visits from strangers to the farm, men who arrived late at night and left before dawn. She wrote with growing fear, sensing that something dangerous was approaching their lives. The diary's final entry, dated December 18, 1903, was particularly disturbing. Margaret wrote hurriedly, the words nearly illegible in places. She mentioned a decision James had made without consulting her, one that would change everything. She wrote about a man who had arrived that afternoon, someone from James's past, bringing news that left her husband visibly shaken. Margaret expressed her fear that they were being drawn into something they could not escape. The entry ended abruptly, without conclusion, as if she had been interrupted. Porter took the diary to Mechanicsburg and read it over and over, trying to extract every scrap of information possible. Margaret's words painted a picture of a couple living under increasing tension, hiding aspects of their lives from the community. But what exactly was James doing? Who were these nocturnal visitors? And who was the man mentioned in the last entry? The sheriff decided to dig deeper into James Hartley's past. Until then, everyone assumed he was just an ordinary farmer, someone who had settled in Illinois after coming from elsewhere years ago. But where exactly? Porter sent letters to neighboring counties and nearby states, asking for information on any James Hartley who might fit the missing man's description. The responses began arriving in May, and what they revealed was surprising. There were records of a James Hartley in Henderson County, Kentucky, who had been embroiled in a financial scandal in 1897. This James had disappeared before authorities could question him about fraudulent investments that had left several families in distress. The physical description matched reasonably well, though it was impossible to confirm with absolute certainty that it was the same person. Porter also received information from Indiana, where a man with the same name had been investigated in connection with smuggling goods across the state line in 1899. Once again, the suspect had disappeared before being formally charged. The coincidences were too many to ignore. It seemed increasingly likely that James Hartley was not who the Mechanicsburg community believed him to be, but rather someone with a dark past that had finally caught up with him. This revelation completely changed the perception of the case. If James was on the run from previous crimes, it would explain why he was conducting secret business dealings and receiving suspicious visitors. Perhaps the events of January were a result of his past finally taking its toll. But the question of Margaret still remained. Was she an accomplice or a victim? The diary suggested that she was unaware of many of James's activities, at least initially. Sheriff Porter consulted county marriage records and discovered that James and Margaret had married in Springfield in 1898, shortly after arriving in Illinois. There were no previous records of them in the area. Margaret had used the surname Mitchell before her marriage, and Porter was able to trace her family back to a small town in Ohio. He wrote to the authorities there, requesting information about the Mitchell family. The answer added another layer to the mystery. The Mitchell family confirmed that Margaret had left for the West in 1897, after her parents' death. She had mentioned in letters that she had met a man and planned to marry, but after that, communication became sporadic. The last letter she sent to a sister was from 1899, and in it Margaret seemed happy, mentioning life on the farm and plans for the future. Nothing suggested trouble or danger. So what had changed? How had a woman seemingly content with her life in 1899 reached the state of fear and despair, evident in her diary entries in 1903? 4 years had passed, enough time for much to happen, for secrets to be revealed, and illusions shattered. Margaret had discovered something about James, something that frightened her, but from which she could not escape. Porter began to plot a chronology of events. James arrived in Illinois in 1897 or 1898, possibly fleeing trouble in Kentucky. He met and married Margaret, a vulnerable young woman who had just lost her parents. They settled on the farm in Mechanicsburg, keeping a low profile. For a few years, things seemed normal. But sometime in 1902 or 1903, James's past began to resurface. Nighttime visitors appeared. Questionable dealings were conducted. Margaret discovered disturbing truths. In December 1903, something happens that precipitates a crisis. A man from James's past appears with news or demands. Perhaps threats have been made. Perhaps James owes money or is involved in something he simply cannot walk away from. The couple is forced to make a drastic decision. In January 1904, they leave in a hurry, leaving everything behind, accompanied by a third man, the young man seen in Decatur. Sheriff Porter's theory was beginning to take shape, but there were still significant gaps that needed to be filled. The issue of the suitcase found in the river remained unexplained. If the couple were fleeing, why discard Margaret's valuables so carelessly? And why choose the Sangamon River, which was in the opposite direction from the route to Decatur? These inconsistencies suggested more than a simple escape. In June 1904, a new witness unexpectedly emerged. A railroad worker who had been ill for months and was only now learning about the case through the newspapers approached Sheriff Porter. The man, named Robert Hayes, worked maintaining the lines that ran through Sangamon County. He reported something he had witnessed on a freezing January night, around the 12th or 13th. He couldn't recall the exact date. Robert was inspecting a secluded stretch of railroad near an area known as Clear Lake when he saw a wagon parked next to the tracks. It was late, past 9 o'clock at night, and the temperature was brutally cold. What caught his attention was the behavior of the people in the wagon. There were 3 individuals, 2 men and a woman. One of the men was clearly agitated, gesturing nervously while repeatedly glancing toward the tracks, as if waiting for something. The woman sat in the back of the wagon, wrapped in blankets. Robert couldn't see her face clearly due to the darkness and distance, but he noticed that she seemed motionless, almost unmoved by the biting cold. The second, younger man remained by the horses, keeping them calm. Robert considered approaching to offer assistance, but something about the scene made him uneasy. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that his presence would not be welcome. He continued his inspection, and when he returned the same way about an hour later, the wagon had disappeared. Robert thought about it for the next few days, but eventually forgot the incident, chalking it up to ordinary travelers facing the hardships of winter. It was only when he read about the Hartley case months later that he connected the dots and realized these people might be the missing couple. Robert Hayes's account added a new dimension to the mystery. Clear Lake was located between Mechanicsburg and the Sangamon River, but not on the direct route to Decatur. Why would they be there, waiting near the tracks in the middle of the night? Porter considered several possibilities. Perhaps they were waiting for a freight train that would stop at this isolated spot, a way to travel without being seen or registered. Or perhaps they were meeting someone arriving by train. The sheriff traveled to Clear Lake to inspect the area for himself. It was a desolate place, surrounded by empty fields and small woods. The railroad cut through the landscape in a lonely fashion, rarely used for passenger transport in that region. Freight trains passed occasionally, carrying agricultural products and goods between larger cities. It was exactly the kind of place someone wanting to avoid attention would choose for a discreet rendezvous. Porter spoke with other railroad workers who knew the area. One of them mentioned rumors, never confirmed, that some freight trains occasionally carried more than legitimate goods. Contraband alcohol, stolen goods, even people trying to travel without paying or being identified. It wasn't something that happened often, but it wasn't entirely uncommon at the time. This information opened up an intriguing possibility. If James Hartley was involved with criminal elements, as his past records suggested, he might have connections that would allow him to arrange clandestine transportation. The young man seen with the couple could be a go-between, someone tasked with ensuring they boarded safely and without leaving a trace. This would explain why they were seen both in Clear Lake and later in Decatur, possibly using different modes of transportation to confuse anyone trying to track them. But the suitcase in the river still didn't fit that scenario. Porter examined the evidence again. The bag contained Margaret's clothes and jewelry, but none of James's personal items. This suggested it might not have been discarded by accident or panic, but deliberately. Someone wanted those items found, or at least was willing to get rid of them for some specific reason. The sheriff considered a grim possibility. What if Margaret wasn't traveling voluntarily? Witness descriptions mentioned that she seemed nervous, frightened and silent. Robert Hayes noticed that she remained motionless in the wagon, wrapped in blankets, even in the extreme cold. Could she be being held against her will? Perhaps James, desperate and under pressure from his past troubles, had done something unthinkable. This line of reasoning led Porter to re-examine Margaret's diary with a fresh eye. The final entries revealed growing fear, mention of decisions James made without her input, and a feeling of being drawn into something terrible. Margaret never explicitly wrote that she was in danger, but her anguish was evident. Perhaps she knew she couldn't escape, that she was trapped in a situation she didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized as dangerous. In July, Porter received an unexpected letter. It was from a lawyer in Springfield, representing interests related to the Hartley estate. Apparently, the farm had originally been purchased through a loan that James had never fully repaid. With the couple missing and no payments being made, the bank was filing lawsuits to seize the land. The lawyer wanted to know if there was any update on the Hartleys' whereabouts, as this would affect the legal proceedings. This financial detail added another layer to the puzzle. James was in debt, possibly desperate for money. This would explain why he would engage in questionable business dealings, why he would receive nighttime visitors that Margaret feared. Perhaps the financial problems were just the tip of the iceberg, and James was far more deeply involved in illegal activities than anyone realized. Porter requested bank records and discovered that James had made significant withdrawals from his account in December 1903, almost completely depleting his savings. A few days later, there was a substantial deposit, far larger than would be expected from an average farmer. The source of this money was unknown. It did not correspond to any livestock or crop sales. Where had James gotten this amount? And why, even with the money, did they abandon additional savings hidden in the barn? These financial transactions suggested that something significant had happened in December. James had received money from some source, possibly related to the shady dealings mentioned in Margaret's diary. But this money came with a price. Perhaps it was payment for some service James was supposed to perform, or perhaps it was the result of something he had already done that now required him to disappear quickly. The sheriff spent the summer of 1904 trying to connect all these fragments of information. He had constructed a possible narrative. James Hartley was a man with a criminal past who had settled in Illinois under a false pretense of respectability. Margaret, initially innocent of his secrets, gradually discovered the truth about who she had married. By 1903, James's past began to catch up with him, bringing dangerous people and situations from which he could not easily escape. In the winter of 1904, a final crisis forced James to act. He took all the money he had available, made arrangements with people who could help him disappear, and set off taking Margaret with him, whether she wanted to or not. They traveled secret routes using wagons and freight trains, avoiding main roads and official stations. At some point, possibly during the journey or even before leaving, Margaret was separated from her personal belongings, which ended up in the river for reasons still unclear. It was a theory that explained many of the known facts, but there were still elements that didn't quite fit. Margaret's behavior in Decatur, for example. If she was being forced, why didn't she ask the innkeeper for help? Why didn't she try to escape? Perhaps she was being closely watched by her young companion, or perhaps, despite her fear, she still held some loyalty or hope for James. Autumn arrived, bringing with it an unexpected turn in the case. In September 1904, Sheriff Porter received an urgent telegram from authorities in Cairo, a port city located in the southern tip of Illinois, where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet. The content was brief but shocking. A woman had been found wandering the docks, disoriented and unable to provide coherent information about her identity. The physical description matched Margaret Hartley. Porter immediately set off for Cairo, a journey that took nearly 2 days due to the necessary rail connections. The city was known as a hub for diverse types of travelers and traders, a place where rivers served as liquid highways, carrying people and goods in all directions. It was also a city where one could easily disappear among the throngs of dockworkers, sailors, and transient passengers. When he arrived at the local sheriff's office in Cairo, Porter was taken to a small infirmary where the woman was being kept under observation. The moment he saw her, his suspicions were confirmed. It was definitely Margaret Hartley. But the woman before him was very different from the one the Mechanicsburg community knew. Her hair, once always carefully tied back, was disheveled and unevenly cut. Her clothes were simple and worn, nothing like the modest but well-kept dresses she usually wore. Her eyes had a distant quality, as if she were physically present but otherwise absent. Porter approached slowly, calmly introducing himself. Margaret looked at him without immediate recognition. He mentioned Mechanicsburg, the farm, the names of neighbors and acquaintances. Gradually, something seemed to awaken in her memory. Her eyes filled with tears, and she began to tremble. The sheriff waited patiently, giving her time to process the moment. Finally, in a barely audible voice, she murmured her own name. It was the first sign of lucidity she had shown since she had been found days before. The local doctor who had examined her explained to Porter that Margaret appeared to be suffering from extreme physical and mental exhaustion. She was malnourished, showing signs of prolonged exposure to harsh conditions. There was no evidence of serious injuries, but her psychological state was deeply concerning. She alternated between periods of complete silence and moments of agitation, mumbling incoherent words about rivers, travels, and places the doctor could not identify. Porter spent the next few days in Cairo, visiting Margaret daily and trying, with infinite patience, to extract information about what had happened since January. It was a slow and fragmented process. Margaret had difficulty organizing linear thoughts. Her memories seemed jumbled, mixing events into sequences that didn't immediately make sense. But slowly, piece by piece, a story began to emerge. She confirmed that they had left the farm in January, but not by choice. James was desperate, she explained with a shaky voice. Men had come to the farm in the previous weeks, men making demands James couldn't refuse. He owed money, a lot of it, related to business dealings Margaret never fully understood. James tried to negotiate for more time, but these people were not known for their patience or mercy. The night of their departure was chaotic. James woke her late, telling her they needed to leave immediately. There was no time for detailed explanations or proper packing. He threw some clothes into a suitcase and hurried her out of the house. A young man was waiting for them with a cart, someone James introduced as just a helper. Margaret was terrified, not fully understanding what was happening, but seeing the genuine panic in her husband's eyes. They traveled through the freezing night, avoiding main roads. Margaret remembered the intense cold, the constant fear, the feeling of being pursued, though she never clearly saw who or what. They stopped near the tracks. She recognized it as the place Robert Hayes had described months earlier. There they waited for hours, James constantly looking around, the young man keeping the horses still. Finally, a freight train slowed down enough for them to board one of the empty cars. The train ride was an experience Margaret described as a never-ending nightmare. The carriage was freezing, with no heat or comfort whatsoever. They traveled like that for hours, maybe a whole day, she wasn't sure. The train occasionally stopped, and at one point, James hurried her off. They were somewhere she didn't recognize, but later learned was near Decatur. It was there, in the confusion of the stop, that something happened to her suitcase. Margaret couldn't remember the exact details. Her memory of that moment was particularly hazy. James and the young man argued about something, their voices raised but kept low. The bag had been left behind, she was sure of it, but she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was too heavy. Perhaps James feared it would attract unnecessary attention. Somehow that suitcase had ended up in the river, though Margaret had no idea how. In Decatur, they spent a night at the inn, exactly as Edmund Price had reported. Margaret remembered being too exhausted to clearly process what was happening. She heard James and the young man talking in hushed tones, making plans they didn't share with her. In the morning, they boarded a train again, this time as regular passengers, using names that weren't their own. James had false documents, something that shocked Margaret deeply. How many secrets was her husband keeping? They traveled south, passing through several towns. Margaret lost track of time and place. They stopped occasionally, stayed a few days in cheap inns, then moved on. James seemed to be searching for something or someone, but never explained clearly. The young man who had accompanied them from the beginning stayed with them for a few weeks. then disappeared one night without warning. Margaret woke up, and he was simply gone. After that, it was just her and James traveling with no apparent destination. Her husband was visibly changing. The man she knew, even with all his secrets, was consumed by paranoia and despair. He saw threats around every corner, suspicious of every stranger who looked his way. They began to run out of money, having to take temporary jobs at farms and businesses along the way. At some point, Margaret couldn't pinpoint when, they arrived in Cairo. The town was chaotic and noisy, so different from the rural tranquility of Mechanicsburg. James said they needed to find passage on a boat that would take them downriver, perhaps to New Orleans, where they could start over completely. He was increasingly agitated, sleeping little, constantly looking over his shoulder. It was on one of those nights in Cairo that everything fell apart for good. Margaret woke alone in the small room they shared in a guest house near the docks. James had left, saying he would be back in a few hours, but when morning came, he still hadn't returned. She waited all day, then another day. On the third morning, she accepted the terrible reality. He had abandoned her. Margaret had no money, no one she knew, no way to get home, or even if she still had a home to return to. The shock of this realization, coupled with months of tension and fear, finally broke something inside her. She wandered the streets of Cairo, lost not only physically but mentally. The following days were a haze in her memory. She remembered worried faces, people trying to talk to her, but she couldn't respond coherently. Eventually, someone took her to the authorities, and that's how the local sheriff found her. Porter listened with a mixture of compassion and frustration. Margaret's story filled in many gaps, but it also raised new questions. Where was James now? Why had he abandoned his wife after months of running away together? Was he hiding somewhere in Cairo, or had he actually boarded a boat and set off downriver? And who exactly were these people they were fleeing? The sheriff conducted his own investigation in Cairo, speaking with boarding house owners, dock workers, and anyone who might have seen James Hartley. Some vaguely remembered a man matching the description, but no one had any concrete information about his current whereabouts. Cairo was a transit town, with people constantly arriving and departing. A lone man wanting to disappear would have no trouble achieving it. Porter also investigated the ships that had departed Cairo during the period James disappeared. There were several steamships that plied the southern route, carrying passengers and cargo. Records were inconsistent. Many captains didn't keep detailed lists of who boarded, especially if the passengers paid cash and didn't cause trouble. It was entirely possible that James was somewhere along the Mississippi by now, perhaps as far away as Louisiana, or even further afield. Margaret was too physically weak to travel immediately, so Porter stayed in Cairo for a few more weeks, ensuring she received proper care and time to regain her strength. During this time, he continued to extract more details from her confused memories. She mentioned places they had been, the names of cities she could remember. Porter meticulously wrote everything down, hoping that some detail might eventually lead to James. As Margaret gradually regained her strength, Porter devoted himself to investigating the clues she had provided. One piece of information in particular caught his attention. Margaret had mentioned that during their stay in a small town south of Decatur, James had received a telegram that had left him visibly shaken. Although she didn't know the message's content, she clearly remembered her husband's reaction. He read the telegram repeatedly, then burned it in the fireplace of their room. Porter traveled to that town, identified by Margaret as Centralia, located in Marion County. He visited the telegraph office and, after explaining the nature of his investigation, gained access to records of telegrams sent and received during the period in question. Finding the specific one was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but he eventually located an interesting entry. A telegram sent from St. Louis to an addressee identified only as J. Hart in February 1904. The recorded content was cryptic but suggestive. Agreement broken, situation untenable, no way back. The message was signed with initials that meant nothing immediately to Porter, but the tone was unmistakable. This was a communication between people involved in shady dealings, and the content suggested something had gone terribly wrong. If this telegram was indeed intended for James Hartley, it would explain why he became even more desperate after receiving it. The sheriff decided to make another trip to St. Louis. The city was much larger and more complex than any other Illinois location he had investigated previously. With hundreds of thousands of residents, finding specific connections to James Hartley seemed nearly impossible. But Porter was persistent, and now he had a starting point: the telegraph office from which the message had been sent. The clerk who had answered the message's sender didn't recall specific details, but records showed the address from which the telegram had been dispatched, a commercial district near the river. Porter spent days traveling the area, visiting businesses, talking to merchants and residents. It was in a tavern frequented by dock workers that he finally obtained a valuable clue. The owner of the establishment, a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller, remembered James Hartley, though he knew him by another name. Heinrich explained that the man had frequented his tavern a few years earlier, always in the company of other individuals Heinrich described as people it's best not to know too well. These men were involved in backroom dealings, unauthorized imports of goods, illegal gambling, and exorbitant interest loans to desperate individuals. James, or whoever he was at the time, had become deeply involved in this circle. Heinrich had heard rumors that he owed significant sums and had tried to defraud some very dangerous people. There was a confrontation, the details of which Heinrich didn't fully understand, and afterward, James simply disappeared from St. Louis. This would have been around 1897 or 1898, exactly when records suggest he had arrived in Illinois and met Margaret. The story was beginning to come together. James Hartley had fled St. Louis with debts and dangerous enemies, settling in Mechanicsburg under a veneer of respectability. For a few years he managed to keep his past hidden, but eventually those he had fled from found him. The nocturnal visits mentioned in Margaret's diary were likely debt collectors or middlemen sent to demand payment of old debts, with interest accruing over the years. Porter had obtained a few names through Heinrich, people believed to have been involved in those shady dealings years earlier. Many had died, others disappeared, and some were in prison. But one name in particular stood out, a man known only as Dalton, described as an extremely dangerous man who controlled much of the illegal operations in the Port District. If James owed Dalton money, it would explain the level of desperation that led to his hasty escape from Illinois. The sheriff tried to locate this Dalton, but discovered that the man was as elusive as a shadow. No one admitted to knowing him directly, though everyone seemed to know him. He operated through intermediaries, never revealing himself personally. Porter understood he was dealing with someone who had carefully built layers of protection around himself, making himself nearly impossible for authorities to reach. Frustrated, but not defeated, Porter returned to Cairo in late October. Margaret was significantly better, both physically and mentally. She had regained weight and her eyes had lost that distant, frightened look. She spoke more coherently, though certain topics still visibly upset her. The doctor deemed her well enough to travel, as long as the journey was undertaken carefully and without haste. Porter arranged for her to return to Mechanicsburg, a journey that took several days. Margaret was apprehensive about returning, unsure of how the community would welcome her after everything that had happened. The sheriff reassured her, explaining that people were worried and relieved to know she was alive. The story of her forced disappearance had circulated, and most of her neighbors were sympathetic to her plight. When they finally arrived in Mechanicsburg in November, Margaret was met with mixed reactions. Some welcomed her warmly, rejoicing at her safe return. Others kept a cautious distance, unsure of the details of what had happened, and perhaps suspecting she knew more about James's business than she admitted. The farm was still there, now in a state of advanced abandonment, overgrown with wild vegetation that had grown during her absence. Margaret didn't want to return to the property. The memories of that place were too painful, tainted by the secrets and fears that had permeated her last months there. A family from the church offered temporary housing, while she decided what to do with her life. The bank was still processing the foreclosure, and it seemed inevitable that she would lose the land anyway. Over the next few weeks, Porter continued his investigation, now focused on determining James's whereabouts. He corresponded with authorities in cities along the Mississippi, sending detailed descriptions and urging them to be on the lookout. He also contacted deputies in New Orleans, suspecting that the cosmopolitan city was exactly the kind of place where someone like James would try to disappear into the diverse crowd. In December 1904, almost a year after the initial disappearance, Porter received a promising report from New Orleans. A man matching the description of James Hartley had been seen frequenting the city's waterfront districts, occasionally working as a longshoreman and living in squalid conditions. The informant was a local police officer who had become interested in the case after reading about it in a newspaper circulating between different southern cities. Porter considered traveling to New Orleans himself, but the winter weather made such a journey extremely difficult and time-consuming. Furthermore, there were complex legal issues. Technically, James Hartley wasn't wanted for any specific crime in Illinois. He had abandoned debts and his wife, behaviors that were morally questionable but not necessarily criminal under the law at the time. Missouri authorities might have had charges that could justify his arrest, but proving connections to illegal activities from years ago would be challenging. The sheriff decided the best approach would be to work through local authorities in New Orleans, providing them with all available information and asking them to keep an eye on the suspect. If James was truly there, he would eventually make a mistake that would allow his capture. Porter also considered that perhaps Margaret should be informed, but hesitated. She was finally beginning to rebuild her life, finding some peace after months of trauma. Knowing that James was potentially so close could undo all the progress she had made. Meanwhile, life in Mechanicsburg went on. The winter of 1904 was milder than the previous one, a blessing for farmers and travelers. Margaret had begun working as a helper at a small local school, teaching sewing and crafts to the community's young people. It was a modest occupation, but it gave her purpose and some financial independence. She spoke little about James or the months on the run, preferring to focus on the present and the uncertain future she was trying to build. Porter watched her progress with satisfaction, but also with concern. He knew that as long as James remained at large, a shadow would always hang over Margaret's life. And then there was the matter of the men from St. Louis, the ones who had forced James to flee. If they knew Margaret was back in Illinois, they might see her as a form of pressure, a way to force James out of hiding if he still cared the slightest about her. The year 1905 brought developments no one could have predicted. In February, Porter received disturbing news from New Orleans. The man who had been identified as possibly James Hartley had disappeared again. According to the local officer who had been following the case, the suspect simply stopped appearing at the places he usually frequented. His last recorded sighting was on a foggy night near the Port District warehouses, talking to two unidentified men. After that, no one saw him again. The sudden nature of this disappearance raised immediate suspicions. New Orleans, despite its reputation as a vibrant and vibrant city, also had an extremely dangerous side. The port districts were controlled by rival gangs vying for territory and lucrative business deals. People disappeared frequently in these areas, some by choice, others due to far more sinister circumstances. The Mississippi River had witnessed secrets that would never be revealed, carried by its murky waters to the Gulf of Mexico. Porter shared this information with Margaret carefully, preparing her for the possibility that James might never be found again. Her reaction was complex and difficult to interpret. There was evident relief, a sense that perhaps this chapter of her life could finally be closed. But there was also sadness, not for the man James had revealed himself to be, but for the illusion she had lost, for the life she thought she had built that had crumbled so completely. She told Porter something she had never mentioned before. In the last few days they spent together in Cairo, James had changed. The paranoia and despair that had consumed him gave way to something else, a kind of somber resignation. He spoke of regrets, of choices he had made years ago that had led him down a path from which he could no longer return. Margaret realized then that her husband had accepted that there was no escape, that eventually his past would catch up with him one way or another. This revelation cast a